Big thanks to our sponsors who make the pudding possible.
The American Camp Association of Illinois is made up of nearly 289,000 members, volunteers, campers, families, and professionals who believe in the power of camp. They work to disrupt the effects of poverty by providing fundamental services for children and families and learning opportunities for camp professionals. Learn more about ACA Illinois by visiting acail.org. You know the impact you want to make in a child's life, but figuring out the day-to-day details can be overwhelming. Let Camptivities help you make that impact by streamlining the creation of your camp activity schedules. Schedule a demo at camptivities.com.
Welcome to the pudding.
The sweet proof of research to back up what you already know about summer camp.
I'm Dr. Mandi Baker, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Travis Allison, he and him. And we are pleased today to welcome Drs. Lisa Meerts-Brandsma and Jim Sibthorp to talk about their very cool research in the camp world. And before we get into the specifics about the research, Lisa, I wonder if I could start with you. How did you become a researcher in the camp world?
I would say that I became a researcher by accident. My first job out of college was as a journalist, doing a lot of interviewing and talking to people, which I really liked, but the journalism industry was collapsing and I went back into outdoor recreation, worked in the field for a while, and I kind of bounced back and forth. Ultimately, I thought that I wanted to teach at a university. So I went back to get a PhD so that I could teach. And then I found out that research actually blended all of the things that I was passionate about. So getting to talk to people, getting to think about what they were telling us through interviews. I learned about more quantitative data as well and how to analyze that. And I realized teaching's great, but research is just so exciting because you get to explore all of these different questions and you get to chase all of your interests. And so in a way, it's a lot like journalism. It's just speaking to a different audience. So I think that's how I became a researcher.
This is my story too, Lisa. I was like, oh, I want to teach and I don't want to do as much behavior management as middle schoolers. So then I thought that if I just kept going, I could teach at a university level. So a small side note, there's just as much behavior management. It's just different. And it was the same thing. I fell in love with research. I was like, wow, this is cool. You can ask people questions, find out their stories, do stuff with it. And I also discovered I liked theory, which I genuinely did not like up until that point. I ground through it in earlier years. So it's funny how we come to these things with these weird ideas in our head, like, I'm just going to be a teacher. And it turns out you fall in love with all of it.
Absolutely.
Jim, what's your story?
I guess it depends if you want the long story or the short story. The short story is not that different than Mandi and Lisa's, which is basically I went to get a PhD because I wanted to teach and I found I really liked research. The slightly longer story is I was running field semesters in the sciences. And so I was doing marine biology, marine geology, and nautical archaeology semesters and summer field schools. And because I came out and I was an engineer at that time. And I really became curious when we'd interview the students at the end, meaning these were college students, and they didn't talk at all about the science that they had learned. And they talked a lot about their own personal growth through being on expeditions that operated 24 hours a day or that were in remote locations that required teamwork. And I was like, this is really interesting that people are talking about kind of these transformational experiences in these outdoor remote environments. And that got me really curious about how outdoor education can be a medium for personal growth and development. And that led me into ultimately summer camp as a way to scale the work we were doing in deeper, but also not as accessible types of outdoor education like Outward Bound or working with NOLS. And so summer camps reach a lot more kids, they're a lot more accessible. And so I decided that was probably a way, if you're going to try to make a difference, a bigger difference, that it would make sense to take some of our research and learnings from these other places and bring them back into more accessible spaces for kids.
Wow. I mean, you're actually opening up the next question for me to chase that vein is what is your research about? Before we do that, I'm going to take you back. What ology was that? You said a word there and I was like, I don't know what that is.
Nautical archaeology, marine biology. I'm not sure which one.
What does that
Nautical archaeology, which is basically underwater archaeology.
Very cool.
So we would go map shipwrecks. And of course, shipwrecks, they wreck lots of places. Sometimes they're quite remote. Sometimes they're in water that you can't see anything in.
Yeah.
And so they were often quite challenging to work on from the participants' perspectives.
Yeah.
Like if you're going
Yeah.
diving in a place that has no visibility. And so they would talk about that as personal challenge and how they overcame that, or how they had to work with the group or support others, or all these different things.
That's fascinating. That's so fascinating. I admit I like to dive, and so I'm very curious about anything that has to do with diving. I watched a doco on a shipwreck dive not too long ago, and just it was mind blowing how complex the task is, and actually going through and mapping out a shipwreck. Like it was just wow. The other term you used was knolls, and I'm not sure if everybody listening would know what knolls is.
Yeah, so Knowles, they're trying to brand as just Knowles now, kind of like IBM is an IBM, but
Yeah.
they really started as the National Outdoor Leadership School. And so they're a large wilderness education school in primarily based headquartered in the US, but they run programs globally. And I guess my only point with that is I think they run really great programs, but they're
Mm.
not accessible to very large swaths of the population.
Yeah, a lot of the programs are pretty remote. I suppose the other thing about Knowles, my bumping into them in Australia, is they also help set some of the standards of how qualifications are understood across countries. So that's how I first found out about Knowles. I didn't even know it existed. Got into Australia, and people are like, "What does this bit of paper mean?" And we were able to go back, and it gave some global currency to what happens in the outdoors. Well, I'll bring you back to it. Tell us about what kind of research you've been doing and what would you call your kind of camp research? What are the kinds of things you've been doing?
I mean, I can start and then Lisa can jump on. The main thing I say most of my research is about how to maximize the developmental potential of outdoor education for youth. And so we focused a lot on really how we can make these experiences and how camp providers can make these experiences most developmental. And so that looks like lots of things, but what do relationships look like? What does design look like? How is the program implemented? Which parts of those programs are what we would call active ingredients. So the parts
Yeah.
that really do enact change versus just parts of what every camp is. And then that has led us, of course, into many different things because different youth and different situations and different camps need different kind of active ingredients, or they need different pieces of the camp that make that experience appropriate and developmental for them. That's what's got us into some of the access and culturally
Mm,
responsive pieces. But it's also just got us into understanding that if a kid needs more social development, that camp might look different than someone who's
mm,
working on self-regulatory skills. And those, of course, vary by age, they vary by population that camp serves. Some kids need maybe more exposure to nature, some kids need less of that. And so it's a really rich mixture of things that we've looked at over the years. But
mm.
fundamentally, my research is about trying to maximize the developmental potential of these summer camps and outdoor education spaces.
What our listeners might not know that I can add in here from knowing myself. Jim's been at this for a little while. When did you finish your PhD, Jim? Can you remember?
99. Yeah,
99.
1999.
Right. So I'm not sure if everybody listening would know this, but Jim's been at this for quite a long time in terms of how old camp research really is as a field. I would say our field is maybe 30 or 40 years old. And he's had the fortune of studying with some of the people I regard as kind of the early thought leadership and early writers in the research on camp. So I'd like to say, Jim, you are a revered member of the academy in our field, one of the leaders for sure. So thank you. How about you, Lisa? What's your research about?
Sure. I think that the research that I'm most focused on right now is about increasing access. And so I think with what Jim just said, when I came in as a student, a PhD student, we were looking at a lot of those different pieces, the developmental parts. I did some initial work looking at identity formation and transformative learning. But the question that has always driven and motivated me is how do we get more kids to be able to access these types of spaces? Part of that is because I believe that a lot of times camp and similar types of recreation spaces can be really critical because it can be a home, it can be a safe place, it can be a place for kids to figure themselves out. Therefore, how do we get as many people as possible into those spaces? And with kind of what's gone on culturally, a lot of that is looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because if you look at who has historically been able to access camp in the United States, we're talking about youth who are white, youth who are affluent, youth who have an intersection of those identities. And so what I'm interested in is what are the pathways to camp? what is the experience within camp? And then also, how do we help camp and other types of recreation providers articulate their value so that people will invest in them? Because I think that there's multiple prongs that need to be hit on in order to increase access. It's not just any one of those levers.
Well, I'm very enthusiastic about a paper that you and Jim and there was another author. What's the other author's name?
I think it was Ty was on
There we
this.
go. You wrote an incredible paper that came out only recently, about a year and a half ago now. I just think it was an incredible piece of writing in terms of mapping out how DEI is being done by some of the best practices in the country. And then, of course, I agitated and poked and prodded until Lisa would write something along those lines for the camping magazine. So if you're in the United States and you have access to the ACA's camping magazine, you'll see that there is a more accessible version of that article, although that article is open access and you can get your hands on it from the Journal of Youth Development. What a lovely piece. It does such a good job of mapping a very big picture as well as detailing out practical strategies. We don't always see that in academic writing, listeners. Sometimes we get caught up in our results and our theories and our concepts, but this is a really lovely piece. It's very accessible. So thank you. I'm excited to see more of that work.
I'd like to not skip past that if we can.
Yeah.
What is the stuff that you learned specifically from this paper? But what is the stuff that you learned and how camps can apply it? Because the work we do, work with a lot of small consultants and practice trainers and things. And those who have a very specific DEI focus to their practice are finding that they're not getting hired now. And so I wonder from your lessons how we can inspire others to consider the value of this and what the practical applications of how we get more different people to take a chance on camp.
I'm unclear on if this is about the research or if this is about the practical implications of getting more people into camp. Could you reframe that?
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely about the research. I want to know what you learned and how it applies to this case, because I think that camp very wisely had a few years of attention on this. And the four of us here are motivated for that attention to stay high, but I don't think it is. So I wonder if for the stuff that you researched, the stuff that you learned, how can people apply that to getting more different families to consider summer camp as an option for their kids?
So this particular paper, what we did is we asked camps about different strategies that they use to be more inclusive. And so they're kind of bucketed into 5 categories. And part of it was just about figuring out like what is actually going on in camp. And part of that is because if we're trying to be more inclusive, right, there's lots of conversations, but do we have any research evidence to back that up? Before we can assess what works best or how different parts work, we need to understand what is actually going on. This paper was looking at that more broadly. We did a large survey, but then we also did interviews. And in the interviews, we were talking to folks who are working at camp and getting a little bit more detail, a little bit more nuance about what we were unpacking through that survey. And I think one of the pieces that became really clear, there's a graphic towards the end of the paper that's talking about people's values. And so when you're thinking about becoming a more inclusive camp space, you as a camp may have different values from what your campers want and from where the community you actually hire your staff live. And so you have to wrestle with all of those different pieces. And I think that anyone who's doing this work knows that there's no roadmap, but I think this paper made it really clear that there is not a roadmap, right? You have to look at all of those different spaces and figure out what makes the most sense. And there are some strategies that are easier or earlier in a camp's progression in terms of becoming more inclusive. And so we can think about like, how are you dealing with food choices, right? Are you able to be inclusive in terms of making sure that there's vegan options and gluten-free options, right? Like all of that kind of stuff, food options that are going to allow people to accommodate their religious practices, right? And that's probably more palatable to a community that maybe is somewhat resistant to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And maybe that's where your camp starts, right? Then there's things that are more challenging, probably because they're more charged, like having gender neutral housing or gender neutral bathrooms. And so camps that are further along in their journey might be diving into those kinds of spaces. But a camp ultimately wants to exist, right? And if they're going to alienate the populations that they're working with in an effort to be inclusive, then the camp is not going to thrive. And so there's definitely a balancing act. And I'm sure some people would wish that it would all go faster, but I think the takeaway from this is you have to understand the culture, the context, and then find within this, there's a list of strategies. I think there's about 23 of them. and look, well, where can you begin? And you can also see what other camps are doing and which ones are more common. And that can help a camp start to consider where they should move with those efforts.
I think there's always a great deal of passion and enthusiasm that seems to be the spark at the beginning of the efforts of DEI, but unfortunately, that passion at times can be very impatient. And so, what your paper maps out is it's actually a process, and
Mhm.
for it to be successful long term, and this isn't just socially around inclusion, but financially.
Mhm.
It's a process that you have to step your way through and making good decisions about the right steps at the right time. You don't dump all your money into, say, a structural change before you have a cultural acceptance of that change. And so the paper is brilliant in making those steps clear. And I think some of the steps that you name for groups that and sites and camps and so forth that have done this kind of work, it's almost like they don't see some of those little things because they've already done it and now they take it for granted. What your paper actually helps do is say, oh, you know that thing that seems really obvious to you where you cater to people's eating or dietary requests? Actually, that's really an important step in saying you have a place here because we will take care of your needs here. And this is, those basics of food and shelter are things that are safe and comfortable and reasonable. And a lot of folks, they have done that shift into nutrition and dietary requirements, and it's taken for granted. This paper goes, hanging on a second. At the very beginnings, these small little things are very important steps, and they're not necessarily huge ones. I think the other thing that paper stands out to me is get your policies in order in the sense of it doesn't have to be big, massive documents, but articulate what you're about and articulate what that inclusion looks like for you. Inclusion can mean all sorts of things to lots of different people. So getting clear about that and having your vision, your mandate very clear across your board and your leadership and your staff and your campers and the communities and the parents and the families that are feeding into that camp, being clear about what that is and doing it in steps where you take people with you. You don't ostracize straight up and down right off the beginning. And yes, there'll be camps that make some hard decisions, and yes, they will lose some of their campership. Those are some of the decisions that may have to happen, but it's sensibly and strategically done, and that's what this paper sort of calls for. So it's a good one. You can see why I get excited.
I love your enthusiasm for it. It's really exciting for a researcher to have somebody else be so excited about the work that you've been doing.
Well, I mean, it comes so naturally because I clearly share your passion. Out of curiosity, what motivated this particular piece of work? Like, what were you guys just sitting around having lunch one day and just went, "Damn, this thing's missing"?
So I'm going to let Jim take that part
Okay.
because this actually came from some work that was done before I ended up at the University of Utah. Jim can probably speak a little bit better to the origins of this particular project.
Yeah, I mean, it really came out of, so when we were doing the youth impact study, which was intentionally sampled to kind of mirror and serve accredited camps. So the populations that we pulled in for that study were largely accredited camps. That's the population ACA primarily serves, American Camp Association. And so we knew they were predominantly affluent, they were predominantly white, and they predominantly had some connection to camp, meaning the campers and families we spoke with. And so as we started doing that work, we started to realize we're really missing a narrative around what would be either camps that aren't accredited, but are serving very kind of specific populations, and also how kind of minority voices are elevated in this conversation.
Mm.
And so with that work, we decided to do, and when I say the research advisory committee for that group, decided that some work around kind of equity and inclusion was important. And so we started trying to figure out how to reach different groups and understand what they're doing around that pathway. And that effort did several different studies. I mean, the stuff Ty was doing with her thesis, where we used a more diverse sample of campers and their parents, the stuff that Bren was doing around with the Girl Scouts and looking at how they're creating inclusive practices. And then this study itself, which was, so if you're looking at the campers and the kind of the panel sample stuff that Ty was doing and some of the staff in the interviews that Bren was doing, then this was kind of to complement all that, meaning looking at what camps are saying they're doing in a benchmarking sense so that we have some idea of what the industry is doing in real time so that we can see if we're moving forward from it. And that had to do with that, trying to get camps to how ready they are to change some of these things as well. And that comes back to a lot of the stuff Lisa says. So it really did all spin off of the youth impact study. We knew going into that study, to be fair, that we were missing that piece, and that was intentional. And again, by we, I mean the Research Advisory Committee, but that committee was always very sensitive that there was important information we were missing, and to try to pull that in before we wrap that study up.
Yeah. And I think that's a common thing often in research and in practice is we sort of keep talking about what we can see. We don't talk about what's missing from the picture. And that question of who's not here. So if you're a practitioner out there looking around at your open play moment and looking across the field and saying, who's not here, who's missing from this picture in terms of potentially, and like your paper points us to specifically, who is in the community though. So the comparison isn't necessarily who's not here entirely to the whole world everywhere, but this is the question of who's not here compared to the community from which these families are coming from. And sometimes that's not geographically the same region as the campsite. Sometimes it's a couple hours away, but the same question can be raised. So I'm thinking in my head that in Ontario, in Canada, the Muskokas are known for camp country, cottage country, but they're often serving families from Toronto and Toronto region. And when you think about Toronto as a city, it's a very multicultural, very, very diverse population. And yet when we look around the camp fields, that representation isn't there. So the question kind of is saying who's not here and how do we capture their stories? Because we haven't been talking to them. We haven't been building up those relationships for years. So how do we capture those stories? How do we get their stories? What are they? And are we ready to sit with that, in the, well, we don't want to send our kids to camp. Well, okay, tell me why. It's always a fascinating question. We don't do that often, but when we do it, I love that we do. Like we get some really good stories. The next question sitting with me, and it's directed for you, Jim, is knowing that you've had a few years in this field, what are some of the evolutions you've seen in camp research? How has the research changed, grown, evolved?
I guess I would make 3 points to that. And I guess I would say in some ways it hasn't changed a lot because I think we still are underfunded and we tend to piggyback a lot of things on like master's theses. And so we get a lot of kind of studies that are manageable and reasonable to ask a student to do. And so I see those as a professor as research as pedagogy, and I don't mind those, but they make it hard to build a body of knowledge on. You talked about, I've been around a long time. I came in and was mentored by Carl Anderson and Deb Beleshki and Marge Scanlon. There's plenty of people who've been doing this longer than me. The goal is to build this body of knowledge. So I think we're slowly building it, but in some ways it's very slow. I think what has changed recently is, I think it's a function of society. I think it's a function of ACA doing visibility and advocacy and the industry doing a good job. But we're finally becoming seen as part of this learning landscape or educational ecosystem. And different things have contributed to that. I think COVID contributed. I think testing focus in the US has pushed a lot of extracurriculars out of school. That's just pushed them into the summer. And so I think people have started to say, oh, well, maybe the summer thing is important. That summertime report that the National Academies did, I think elevates the importance of summertime in development. And then ultimately, I think some of these funding mechanisms like the Lilly Endowment stuff that's happening now, the Margaret A. Cargill philanthropies, I think you're getting folks interested in trying to understand and provide access. And that's also allowing the research to progress. But to come back to your question, I think if you go back to like Dimmock stuff in the 20s, I mean, that's just pretty good research on one camp. And we still see a lot of stuff that's not that dissimilar from those studies. I do think, we've answered all the easy questions and now we're just left with the hard ones. I've heard Carla say that before. And I think she's right. I mean, so we're kind of at the point where we have to look at it as an ecosystem. And that means it's a lot more complicated because there's a lot more, well, who's the participant and where are they coming from? And what are their other influences on their lives? And how did they just land? Instead of the old model was kids just come to camp and then we look at what they do while they're here and then they disappear. And that's our research study. And now we're really starting to look at, well, the camp is just a part of this child's life. And how do we rectify the realities pre-camp, post-camp with what they're doing at camp to make it meaningful for them?
Jim, what was that study from the 20s you said?
So Dimmock and Headley, is it Headley? I think it,
They're the
Didn't like in
researchers?
Hendy. I think it was a Canadian camp, actually. It was a Camp Algonquin or something. It was in 1929 was that study was published. And it's called like Character at Camp or something.
Okay.
And it's a pretty comprehensive study. I think he was a professor with John Dewey at University of Chicago.
Mm.
And so he really looked at summer camps. And I guess my only point is, like, if you read that thing, it could have been published recently. And a
Mm.
lot of the conclusions of it, you'd be like, yeah, those don't seem like they make sense today. And I find a lot of that stuff, we do a lot of work with Outward Bound, and a lot of, Kurt Hahn's writings from the 20s also. You look at, kids watching, it's everything spectatoritis, right? It's too much watching events and not as much participating. And now it's TikTok instead of watching basketball at your high school or whatever. But
every once in a while I think on this, and I this is just wonderings. There's not a good deal of research behind it, but I wonder if we keep asking the same questions in camp research, or at least industry seems to keep asking me to ask the same research questions, which is, what is the benefit or what is the value of camp? Have we overdone it? Why do we keep asking that question? Sometimes I get a little like, oh, well, we've done that research. It's done now. Next, please. Because I like the innovative part, where we get to imagine out the new stuff. So 2 questions. Do we need to keep asking this question? Do we have the answer? Like you said, 1929, we had a pretty complete answer. Should we still be asking this question? And 2, why do you think industry keeps asking?
I think we pretty much know what the benefits of camp are as like an industry. But the problem is we don't know for a specific camp. So if a specific camp's going to its funder and it's trying to get a specific group of kids in a specific community to go to that camp and do a specific thing, then we may not know the answer to that. And I think a lot of camps are trying to sell that. They're trying to say, hey, New York Life or whoever, if you give us money, we'll take kids from New York and we'll take them to the Adirondacks and they'll learn to connect with nature or whatever New York Life is funding. And so in that sense, those outcome assessments become important because your camps are different, kids are different, models are different. The funders want that, and that's a way to raise money. And I've always found people, for a long time, they were saying, you're the camp outcomes guy, because I was involved in the youth outcomes battery. But like, I don't actually like camp outcomes. Like, I mean, I don't dislike them, but like as a research, they're not very exciting. But what I have found over the years is they're often the segue to get camps to understand research and to buy into it. So first part is if you can get them to think about, not only use the outcomes to assess what they're doing, but think about how their camp is designing the program to meet the needs of the population to achieve those outcomes, that in and of itself becomes very worthwhile. So if you can get the camps to sit down and go, oh, this is what we do to connect kids with nature. This is what we do to make them more responsible. This is what we do. So in that sense, the outcomes can become very useful to camps. Once camps see that and can start communicating what they do more effectively to their client base, whether it's parents, funders, kids, whoever, then they get more interested in the how. How are we doing that? And then you can start assessing that. And that sometimes is where the more interesting questions are. Like, well, how are you actually doing that? How are you reaching more kids? How are you providing this in a way that's culturally, or whatever the question is? So.
That's actually really helpful. I'm gonna use that next time. Let's talk. Okay, this research is done. Let's look at them. How are you doing this so that they can see it, and then the next conversation comes. Brilliant.
It is interesting, though, from my outsider's perspective, that this is not the first interview. In fact, I think it's the 3rd or 4th interview where someone said, we decided we wanted to study this thing. And then we realized that we had to back up and study the foundation to study the thing. And we're missing a piece, like Lisa said.
Well, I think that one of the parts that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and I don't know if this is where camp research is headed or not, but people, the way society's functioning, it's like, well, what are we doing and how can we package it up? And so I think that there's an effort to say, this is the product, right, that produces this particular thing. And so I actually think that's some of the work that I've started moving into a little bit is what we would call dissemination and implementation science, which is D&I, not DEI. So if you see people talking about that, it can get confusing. But I think that there's an effort to figure out, I think society wants to say, if I send my kid here, and therefore you have to get to the outcome, right? What's the thing you're going to get? But then also, what is the product that you're producing? And I think it's interesting to consider because I think that there's dissemination and implementation science is about how do you put research evidence into practice. So how do you get practitioners to do the things that have evidence behind them? And I think the camp industry is challenging because of the turnover, right? So
Yeah.
you can get this person to do a thing, but when they leave in 1 to 3 to 5 years, how do you get the next person to keep doing this thing? But then also, as Jim was pointing out, it's such a complex system, right? So if we have evidence that this piece works, like under what circumstances, for who, under what conditions, I think that we'll see a push to try to figure out how to quantify these things. I think we may also see a push to increase the quality, right? So if we say that this is the how do you increase, hopefully produce a better outcome? So outcomes probably are not going away, right? That's always going to be a part of the research. But I also think there's just so much turnover, right? And so Jim may have been doing this for 25 years, but someone who's been doing it for 3 thinks it's a really interesting question to figure out what kind of transformation kids experience at camp.
I think there's a degree too to wanting to catch or capture magic. Travis and I have had many conversations about magic, but the transformational experiences can feel very, I don't know, surreal or ethereal, I guess is maybe the word I'm looking for. It's like it's this thing that kind of lives out in an abstract way in the air. And I think the research actually starts to break it down and makes that conversation concrete and articulates it, particularly outcome research. It helps that idea of this is what's happening so that we're not just walking around with this sort of ambiguous term of camp magic, that we can say, here's what's happening, here's what happens, here's how it happens.
Scheduling affects every camper and every staff member's summer. It's easy to make mistakes, it takes a ton of time. Bottom line, scheduling is hard, but it doesn't have to be. Let Camptivities help you create a balanced and engaging schedule without the mistakes and without those long days and late nights. Here's what Camptivities can do for you. Auto scheduling, camper scheduling, group scheduling, elective scheduling, manual adjustments, over 60 different reports, and tons of customizable settings. That and so much more. And don't wait until the new year. Now's the time to find a better way to schedule and save 15% for the first year. We would love to show you the next big thing in camp. Visit camptivities.com to set up a time to chat. Let us help you get away from your desk and back out to camp. Did you know that ACA Illinois' primary work is getting young people to camp from communities that traditionally don't attend? This includes providing services to 9,000 kids and adults from low-income communities throughout the state of Illinois annually. ACA Illinois has deep roots in using camp as a way to create social change in local, state, and national communities, including creating equitable access for all children to attend camp. ACA Illinois loves to try new things and believes it's how we create the most dynamic impact for our campers, staff, and community. This is why ACA Illinois always jumps at the chance to collaborate with content experts and countless volunteers to develop new and innovative programming. Ready to help us achieve this mission? Join us at acail.org. Are you a camp professional looking for community? Are you a camp interested in accreditation but don't know where to start? Are you looking to grow your career? Are you looking for ways to give back? Reach out to us at info@acail.org and let's get you connected.
Well, that might lead pretty nicely into the next question. Lisa, where do you think camp research is headed next?
I think it's those pieces that I was kind of talking about is how do we improve the quality of an experience? How do we get more research into practice? How do we build bridges between research and practitioners so that you're not just talking in the academic sphere and then hoping it trickles down somewhere? I think that as researchers, we are doing, I hope, we're at least interested, I'm interested in how do you build better relationships with camps? I've got some other projects that I'm working on, and we, as a research team, we're sitting in a room going like, well, we think this is the question. Well, that's great, but we're sitting in a room with 3 researchers thinking this is what needs to happen. When what really needs to happen is we need the practitioner in the room, right? We need the camp in the
Yeah.
room. We need the kid in the room, right? We need to make sure that we're not just asking questions that are theoretically interesting to us as much as we might like theory,
Yeah.
but that they're the questions that are going to help practitioners do a thing. And then I think it's just as important as for a researcher to figure out how do you speak this in a way that's going to make sense, right? There's so many academic papers that use like really big terms and jargon and talk about theoretical frameworks and all these different things, but like as a practitioner, who cares, right? That's not important.
Yep.
But the thing is, it probably actually is important, but you
Mm.
have to speak it in the right way. You have to translate it in the right way. And so I hope that as researchers, we're doing a better job of making sure that our work is grounded in practice and with practitioners and that it's not just theoretical. And that I think some of the work is just continually, unfortunately, to justify the camp experience, right? How do we help camps articulate their value? Because I think that's what they need to do. And so figuring out how can we do that by giving them tools. Right, and then again, this goes to, I think, society saying, "Oh, we want a prepackaged thing. So what is this thing? And can you promise me that my kid is gonna get it because I need my kid to have this thing so they can get to this next place?" Jim may also have some interesting ideas on that question.
Where
I
should camp research head next?
I don't know where I mean, it could go a lot of ways, so I don't know where it should go. I think where part of it is gonna go, though, is into looking more at the quality of the experiences piece. And I think part of that is because I think that's what what ACA is really, with the continuous program quality improvement stuff. They're trying to get camps to think more about the experience quality and less about what I would say is the activity base. So it's not so much that the kid goes and learns archery and goes horseback riding. It's the type of experience they're having there. And that experience is what's generative in a sense that it leads to some type of developmental growth in the child. I think we're going to continue to look at that stuff. And I think making it accessible by partnering with these professional initiatives like the program quality stuff is probably where it's going to head.
I'm curious, and either one of you can take this if you feel inspired. So let me look at from what you keep saying is the practitioner, or the person would probably call themselves a camp director or camp leader. How do we bridge between them and their sort of overwork and overwhelm and the valuable stuff, the valuable knowledge that is sitting there for them to use?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's a really hard question. And I think it's one we wrestle with all the time. I think it is things like this podcast, it's things like camping magazine articles. It's you've got to take what in many ways is a very complex ecosystem of elements and simplify them. And as researchers, we're uncomfortable with that because we're oversimplifying something that's quite complex.
I'll say
But
amen
we
to
have,
that.
yeah,
Yes,
but we
we're
have to
uncomfortable.
realize that we're uncomfortable with it. But at the same
Yeah.
time, we have to realize that when we just say a lot of things are complex, that's not very actionable for a camp director. And I think the reason we use practitioners is we also work with other groups that wouldn't identify as camp directors, but people that are in the field. And I think there's a different level too between you might be able to get a camp director to take 30 minutes to do a workshop session at ACA or something on some of this, but then you've got to get it down to the camp staff who's there for the first year and is overwhelmed with how they're going to pass their lifeguarding exam and how to store the canoes at the waterfront and where they're going to go on their day off and how they're going to fit in socially with this new group of peers. And by the way, you've got all these implementation things you're supposed to be doing to increase the quality of our experiences. I think it's a hard thing. And I think, as Lisa alluded to, the turnover doesn't help with some of that. But it really has got to be. And that's one of the things, I think one of your questions later is like, I don't know what accomplishment. I think that you got to partner, right? So as researchers, we've got to partner with practitioners because we can't do everything and we need people to help us bridge and essentially translate what the research is into practical, usable nuggets.
I think to that point, I have a project that is actually working with community parks and recreation, and they were incredibly engaged in that process. And it's been really cool to see how they are now spreading that word. And so I think there's one of my partners is just she's been very grateful to be a part because she came to most of our meetings, right? The research meetings, and she didn't analyze the data, but she understood how we were analyzing the data. And she really grew. And I think that because she grew and she's in a leadership position, she's now well positioned to talk to all these other practitioners. And so I think that involvement becomes really helpful so that we're not just like doing research and then handing them just a product, but that we're integrating that partnership truly from the beginning. And then because this particular woman has seen all of those parts, she can explain it really well and probably better than I can to her peers. But that involvement, which also is a lot of work, right? So we had 4 meetings with the community over the course of a year. And each time that forced us to go, okay, how do we explain it to this audience? What parts of this matter? And so I think it was challenging It at times maybe slowed the research process down, but I also think that the likelihood of some parts getting into practice better, into a camp experience more that are more likely to do that, is going to happen when you have that kind of close partnership.
Well, I'm doing more partnership work too. And what I'm pleased to say, and I don't know if you have the same experience in the States, but we're getting more and more support from federal funding, research opportunities to do partnership research. And, maybe 10 even, but at least 20 years ago, you wouldn't have been supported to do much work with community or in partnership. And yeah, it's a very different experience of doing research. And there's a bit of it keeps you in check, doesn't it? You can't use your 12-letter conceptual words. You have to figure out how to break it down and say it in everyday practice. But like you said, it's rich. And then I find it resonates better too. So the people that they're sharing it with, it's kind of echoing back and forth. Jim, question for you. What do you think we need to do research on next? If you had a magic wand and all the research money in the world, what would be one of those hard questions? You said that, Carla says we keep leaving all the hard questions. What would be your hard question to tackle next?
Boy, what would I guess if that's I don't know if I have an answer to that question.
I'm laughing because I was like, this is a twist on what we prepped Jim to answer. And I was like, researchers need time to think. What did I just do? I just did that in my head. I was like, we like to process and think about these things.
Yeah. I mean, I do think to me, if I really could do it, I'm really mostly interested in just how these different pieces work together, meaning how do these summer camp experiences work with other experiences? And that research is very hard to do because it's system level, community level research, and it's expensive to do. So I guess if you're saying, if I could do anything, though, that's probably the type of stuff I would like to do, is try to go into a community and figure out how all these pieces fit together, not just one camp, but a lot of summer experiences, some of which identify as camps, some of which don't, some of which are family oriented, how the school system fits together, how it meets the needs of the youth. So really looking at holistic youth development instead of looking at what school does and camp does and extracurriculars do and sports do. That's if I had a magic funding pot, that's what I would do.
Yes. Fair enough. Lisa, what about you? What would you do with a magic funding pot? I think that's what we should call it from here on in.
I mean, I guess I would say similarly, I'm interested in how all the parts come together, but I think I might have different parts that I'm interested in compared to Jim, right? I think things that are appealing to me or interesting to me is how does our identity shape our experience, right? So when you think about camp, what is this thing that we call camp and how do people interpret it differently through their different perspectives and positions, and how do they make sense of it and what does it mean to them? So I think those types of questions are pretty interesting to consider. I also think as a researcher, I tend to resonate a lot with qualitative research, but I think quantitative research is really, really important. And so figuring out how can we line these pieces up. So you get the stories, right? You get the pieces that you can kind of understand, but then can you look at trends across society? Can you see patterns quantitatively? So I think that's also another interesting challenge because unfortunately numbers tend to speak louder than stories to funders and funding agencies, and schools want to see growth, parents want to see growth, like this thing got better. So just trying to figure out how can we do quantitative research that really captures all of the nuance of people's individual experience.
Yeah, tricky one.
Lisa, I'll start with you. Do you have some researcher in the field that you think we should talk to next?
So I thought about that. There's someone who I think is always great to talk to, and that's Victoria Povolitis. Have you spoken to Victoria?
You were laughing. She was the
guest
first
this
episode this season. So
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
She's awesome.
But then I was like, so I actually went back and I was like, who else? What would be interesting? And I hope I'm not stealing Jim's thunder on this one. But did you talk to the folks who did the National Economic Impact Study?
No.
Smart. Yeah, that's
Ooh,
great.
So smart.
Yeah. University of Michigan. I forget who it was though, but yeah.
Eli McLean apparently is the lead author on that, at least.
Yeah.
And so I think it'd be really interesting to see what they found out and talk to them. So that might be interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate that because I think because of Mandi's interests and focus, we tend to focus on the sociological aspects of camp, and I'm interested in branching out as we keep going. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, we have another project looking at Oregon outdoor schools. And one of the pieces for the state legislature to move things forward was when they did an economic impact study. And they were like, oh, not only is this good for kids, it actually contributes economically in all these other ways.
Right. Jim, is there somebody you'd recommend?
Well, I mean, I was looking at your thing. I see you spoke with Victoria and Jake and Lori. And so obviously Carla and Deb would be two that would come to mind right away. I think the other one, I just saw her last weekend when I was down in Clemson, that would be really interesting, is Corliss. I think she has a very different, Corliss outlet. She has a very different kind of perspective on camp and outdoors and how that intersects with race and ethnicity. And she's got that RISE lab down there. I think if you wanted to know more about the mental, emotional, social health stuff, Barry's got a big shop down there at Clemson as well.
Yep.
So I think there's plenty of people. Mandi knows all these people, though. So.
Well, we have Barry booked. He's, I think, next in the ranks. We've got him booked. And yes, I keep saying, we got to talk to Carla and Deb. We got to talk to Carla and Deb just to see what their perspective is from where they started and what they, like, how did they see the rest of us coming in and going, thanks for getting things kicked off. This is what we're doing now. So yeah, absolutely. And yes, I do have great respect for Corliss Outley. I've been doing some work with one of her PhD candidates too around race. And it just, every single time I'm like, wow, this is just, it's mind blowing in the best possible way. I feel like I learn something and grow every time too. So that's, yeah, lovely.
And she's just a delightful human to talk to. She'd be such a fun podcast, honestly. Really.
She's a bit of a riot. Yeah. She says lovely. I don't know if she'd do this on podcast, but in person, she says lovely, outrageous, truthful things. And like, I can't stop but grin. And I'm like, she's 100% right. But I wouldn't have said that normally if I was in the grocery store, if that makes sense. She's that type of character. You're like, oh, that's outrageous and true. Oh, yeah. Good point.
I think she would probably say it on a podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah, true. Well, so grateful that you've taken the time and spent it with us today. I have so much respect for the work that you have done, that you are doing, and I'm sure are going to be doing in the future. So thank you for making the time and sharing your wisdom with us here.
Well, thank you both very much. One of the things, and I started alluding to it earlier, we need help, right, from folks that make our research more accessible. And one of the things we always get excited about, as Lisa was saying, is when other people are interested in the work we've done. That's very rewarding. So thank you both for helping us get the word out. And your enthusiasm is super important for us. Because we just sit here in our office in Utah and like we just do research.
And I don't know that people who don't live our weird little world, and research is a weird world. It tends to be a fairly lonely one too. You might spend 2 years writing a paper by yourself or with a partner, a couple of, teammates. And then by the time you get through the revision process and you've published it, it's very anticlimactic. Like it's a massive piece of work, but it's just like, oh, it's in the world. And then that's it. Like one little black and white email that's like, oh, it's in the world. And you're like, oh, okay, cool. That was just 3 years of my life. And so I don't know that we always realize the way that the rest of the world picks this stuff up and actually makes sense out of it. So if you're a listener and you're wondering if these people are untouchable, they are not. You can reach them. You can contact them. And they actually kind of like hearing from you. And when I say that, I can't explain how lovely and warm it feels when an email comes in and goes, I've actually read your work. Unlike my students. No, I'm just kidding. I've actually read your, and there was this thing that I got excited about. Do you have time to explain a bit more? Or would you be able to connect? We don't always have heaps of time, but when somebody genuinely knows our work, gosh, it's a nice feeling. It's a shock. I'll admit that when someone's like, I've read your work. And I'm like, have you really? Okay, cool. So no, these researchers are very reachable and really do actually like connecting with folks. I think that leads to you, Travis.
Yeah,
quite
can
easily.
we facilitate that? Lisa, how can folks get in touch with you to follow up or to find your work?
Oh, well, they can Google my name on Google Scholar if they want to read all of my papers. They're very exciting. But probably the best way to reach me would be via email at the University of Utah. That would be lisa.meerts@utah.edu. I'm not very good at social media, so that would not be the way to find me, but I do have LinkedIn and I do have ResearchGate. So those would be other channels that they could track me down.
That's perfect. Thank you. We're so grateful to have you, Lisa. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on here too.
Jim, how can we get in touch?
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty much the same, except more of a Luddite than Lisa. I don't even have LinkedIn, but I have a very distinctive last name. So if you Google Sibthorp and camps or Utah, you'll probably land on our departmental pages, and my email and phone and stuff are there.
Thanks for joining us. We're grateful.
For all those listeners out there, if you didn't know, now you know, Camp Pros.